You've just entered the No Delusion Zone. I'm David DeBatto. Today, my very special guest is Jonathan Fink. Jonathan's here before, and I'm very, very happy to have him back. Jonathan is the creator and host of the wildly successful YouTube channel Silicon Curtain. Jonathan not only speaks fluent Russian, he is a Russia expert, and he interviews some of the most important and influential people in the world, people who are very involved in the war in Ukraine, experts, professors, authors, writers, elected officials. I highly encourage anyone who hasn't already seen it, check out Jonathan's channel on YouTube, Silicon Curtain. He and I go back a few years. We were each other's first guest, I believe, and we support each other very, very much. And I support what he's doing. So please give Jonathan your support and go to the Silicon Curtain as well. Having said that and buttered him up enough, I'd like to introduce Jonathan Fink. Welcome back, Jonathan.
It's a wonder my head actually fits in the studio there. It's going to bump up against the microphone. No, you're very generous, thank you. But indeed, our connections go back almost 3 years now, right to the sort of start of the full-scale war and the sort of connections we made then and the commonality of our point of view. So it's a real pleasure to be back on again.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we were discussing off air some things that I think we are going to collaborate on later, that we will have announcements on, I hope, very, very soon in support of the Ukrainians, the war effort in Ukraine. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, before we get into Ukraine, which we will devote the balance of this segment to talking about, I would be remiss and foolish if we didn't talk about at least a little bit what's going on here in the States with the new inauguration of President Trump on January 20th. I've talked to you about it quite a bit before this. My opinion, and I really mean this, we are now living in an oligarchy. The beginnings, if not already in a authoritarian form of government. We are no longer a constitutional republic. That ended at noon on January 20th, and it's getting even worse day by day, almost hour by hour. I know what people are feeling here. What's the mood like in the UK right now with the events going on in America?
I think certainly in Europe, in Britain, we're looking askance at what's going on. We're also distracted by the fire hydrant of nonsense that comes out, the sort of, flooding the zone with stuff is clearly a strategy. But of course it works. It works in distracting and deflecting us from looking at what fundamentally is going on. I think unfortunately, there is a certain sense of superiority that certainly, the British can have when they look at the US and go, well, that couldn't happen here. And of course, it's happening in the US. I don't think this idea, of course, is at all helpful because this is an aberration, I think, when you look at American history. Nothing like this has happened before. No figure such as Trump has appeared before. No one with the kind of disregard that we're seeing for legalistic norms, due process, constitutionality, federal structure, division of powers. No one, including Nixon, in US history has wanted to take a wrecking ball to the way things were done previously, the democratic norms. I think a lot of this unfortunately gets missed in a lot of the coverage. We look at the froth, we look at all the nonsense, we might have a laugh at some of the memes and so on, but actually fundamentally it's deeply disturbing. One of the challenges, I think, we don't understand the sort of constitutional norms of our own country. There's a very low level of political education, I think, certainly throughout Britain and other places, and people have a certain detachment from the old party system. We're outgrowing parties, but we haven't found something to replace it. We're outgrowing the old left-right ideologies, and we haven't found something to replace it. So populism falls into that kind of vacuum. So unfortunately, I don't think we're looking at the US with the suitable level of horror, frankly.
Wow. Okay. I'm not surprised because, to be frank, there are some major issues going right on right now in Britain that you folks are dealing with, domestic issues, and I think that, of course, is a distraction. Most people don't want to think about problems in another country, even a country as important as the United States, when their own country is suffering from some major political wounds, if you will. In fact, if you could, what are the major issues that Brits are suffering through right now? What's the political climate like over there for you and the Brits?
Well, I think the unfortunately parts of the media and certainly the political space has become extremely weaponized. We've got a sort of centre-left government. They're making a few mistakes and so on. They're not moving at the pace that some of the people would have liked to see who voted them in. But that doesn't explain the sheer scale of vitriol and the manufacturing of dirt that's being slung at the government. There's something else going on here, which is a sort of weaponization of our information system and our political environment, um, and an exaggerated kind of movement away from traditional politics. Unfortunately, to me, there are very real issues that are driving this, but the politics, the mechanics of politics aren't going to solve it. And again, we see the rise of populism here. We see Farage and his Reform Party actually starting to move into a position as the second party in the country. This is a movement which I think many people are just trying to pretend doesn't exist. The way that they also try to pretend that Brexit isn't having the huge impact on our economy, and our ability to generate income from the government through exports, etc. There's a normalization of what is a very abnormal situation, almost a kind of ostrich head in the sand approach. So I fear we are also sleepwalking into a populist revolution. We are sleepwalking into potentially electing a government who will have very similar sledgehammer techniques that we are seeing, the bull in the china shop kind of techniques that we're seeing in the US. These are exactly the things which one will expect from a reform-led government. And of course, there are the hints and suspicions of connections between authoritarian regimes worldwide. So reform and certain figures in reform. Certainly, there is a dotted line one could draw without making any sort of detailed allegations. There is a dotted line to figures, let's say, of Russian influence and narratives that could potentially be seen as beneficial. So there's this commonality. But of course, Brits wouldn't like to, imagine we're going to fall into the same traps that the US, because we're different, we're smarter, we're all this, we're better educated, etc. It's nonsense, and we're falling into the unfortunately, down the same kind of rabbit holes.
Well, boy, wouldn't Moscow, wouldn't the Kremlin love to drive an even bigger wedge between America's oldest and closest ally, Great Britain? And I believe, from everything that I know, that I've read, and from people I've talked to within the intelligence services, that that's exactly what they're trying to do. There's a lot of Russian influence in Great Britain right now in terms of fake news stories and whole fake media platforms that are feeding just rage and filth and garbage to the British public. That is feeding into this, feeding into exactly what you're saying. And it may, in fact, and probably will, influence the next election.
And we also have quite an oligarchic media structure as well. On the one hand, it adheres to, all the old rules. If you look at the sort of television and so on, it's stuck in the same both sidesisms, which is normalizing a very abnormal situation. It tends towards, I would say, sort of, perceived stability, not pointing out the elephant in the room because that's kind of scary, but trying to create a more, goodness me, you don't want that kind of emperor's got no clothes moment. So everyone's busy pretending the emperor is fully clothed. I think that's where we are with our traditional media. On the print media, you've got declining business models, which are pushing it towards lower levels of professionalism and towards much more extreme clickbait type kind of framing of narratives. So we're in quite a I think, a dangerous media space of combined extremism with normalization, as well as these, defunct commercial models that are run by, oligarchic interests as well. And it's funny you should say earlier in the episode that these guys, you can imagine them functioning under our system, you can imagine them functioning under a Russian controlled system. Because ultimately, for them, it's not about the news, it's about retaining their fortune, their influence, their control. Well, they wouldn't have, that influence control under Russia, but they may be able allowed to keep their fortunes, certainly. So this is the real risk. And this is why Ukraine, one of the first things it did was push oligarchs out of the media structure. Now it's not fully worked, but it's certainly an interesting step, an interesting experiment in how does a democracy retain its resilience when there are many people in society, including moneyed interests, that don't really have, I would say, the best interests of that society at heart. They have their own sort of, commercial objectives, are a higher value system for them than, say, democracy.
Well, we could spend the entire rest of the segment talking about what the Trump administration may or may not do about Ukraine, and we may touch upon that a little bit later. But now I'd like to switch gears and talk about Ukraine. You of course just mentioned Ukraine. I want to let the my viewers know that you just recently returned from a visit to Ukraine, which I understand was very successful. So if you could tell the folks now what you did in Ukraine, how it went, and just kind of elaborate on your trip.
Absolutely. So the first thing is we got to Ukraine. I mean, there's no way to fly to Ukraine, and that's the first thing that actually a lot of people still don't realize is that it's very difficult for Ukrainians to get out of the country and get back in. It's time consuming. And it involves a lot of different modes of transportation, whereas previously you could, fly into Kiev just like you would any other European city. You can't do that anymore. We chose a slightly more difficult and challenging route in that we drove a bunch of trucks over all the way from Dover in the UK to Lviv, which is we traversed the whole of Europe in these vehicles, which in Lviv are going to be converted into frontline evacuation vehicles, or they might have rockets strapped to them, goodness, that kind of stuff. But they're going to be graphicked up, painted up, and they're going to have steel plates inserted in key parts of the vehicle to protect the drivers. So that was a particular thing that was the justification for the trip, was really taking those trucks over. But what I really wanted to do was to record as many voices, many things on the ground as I could, because this is only my second trip to Ukraine. It's both challenging and expensive to get there. And if there weren't for family commitments, then maybe I'd spend an awful lot more time there. But life's complex, so I wanted to grasp this opportunity. I ended up filming maybe 3 or 4 videos a day, which maybe doesn't sound that much, but when you have to get to different parts of the city, set up, record, have little introductory conversations with everybody. Hugely time consuming. So from early morning till late at night, it was a process of kind of recording and trying to absorb all these kind of experiences. We also put on 2 major events. One in Lviv at an office called Index, which is an organization looking at epistemological criminality of the Russian state and looking at how you get justice, especially in, say, written media. And through historical justice, making sure you retain control of narratives even when the war ends. And we also had an event in Kiev interviewing who is considered one of Ukraine's leading sort of intellectual figures and the current president of the Writers' Union, PEN. So putting on 2 major events, doing more than a dozen interviews, plus traveling around, fairly intense, to put it mildly.
Well, it sounds like it was very successful. What was the goal there to just get the voices out of the Ukrainians, to talk to Ukrainian leadership, to the military, to show this to people in the West? What was the main goal that you set out when you went to Ukraine this time?
This is tricky. In such a short, concentrated period of time, you're not gonna have all of the connections that you want to have. I did have a couple of meetings with people in the military. Those weren't recorded actually, because again, in addition to the sort of recorded conversations, I wanted to have some conversations that really connect with the kind of reality of what's going on in a very concentrated form. I think it's very important to try and ground the channel and the videos in a reality rather than inhabiting some informational bubble. When it came to the recorded interviews that people are seeing, yes, it's about getting better information out, but some of the videos that people won't have seen yet because they haven't been published yet are very much about humanizing the struggle Ukrainians are going for. Whether it's an artist in Lviv making sort of satirical prints that also get turned into very powerful memes. He's fighting the information war. I met another charity who are innovating drones. So this is innovating, tech and the military war. We also visited a collective of babushkas, or ladies in their 70s and 80s or even 90s who meet together 6 days a week to sew camouflage netting. They have become so good at this. They get orders from battalions in Kursk. They sewed the nets for the Patriot batteries that protect Kiev and Kharkiv. And to see these ladies in their 80s and 90s doing this stuff is just mind blowing. No one paid them to do that. This is their own initiative. They crowdsource the funds, and they do it because their children, their grandchildren, their nephews, nieces are on the front in the trenches fighting. Some of them have actually lost. One lady who was there while we were filming, she lost her son last year. And in fact, her grandson was wounded and she had to rush away because his condition took a turn for the worst. So this really brings out the absolute directness, but also I've said humanity of Ukraine's resilience. It's not the government's come and told them, what to do and given them a big chunk of money from USA or whatever. It's people seeing an absolute need and they're fighting back. And I think this doesn't get really understood enough. And certainly we see it in the propagandistic memes like, oh, well, Ukraine's fight has cost X amount of its people. Why did they do that? Why did they carry on fighting? Why did they resist when, Russian victory is inevitable? When you look at these people, you realize that nothing is inevitable. And certainly Russian victory is very far from inevitable. You also, when we heard their occupation stories, you realize this isn't a choice between kind of just, fighting for these abstract things. It is literally a fight for survival, because if they did not fight, if they did not resist, all these people would not have made it. They would have been eradicated by the Russians. Anyone with education, anyone who has any get up and go, anyone who wants to see innovation, who wants to fight for better standard of living, who wants to improve governance, who wants to do anything to play an active role in the society. Well, Russia kills these people. Russia does not want them in their state. They want people who are, going to function like zombies, who are not going to question the outright theft of resources. They don't want their population causing trouble. So all these extraordinary characters I met, every single one of them would have had to either leave the country or would have been killed by the Russians. So this puts again some perspective of why Ukraine resists. There is no other option.
Well, I think you've already answered this, but I have to ask. In the West, we see so much what is obviously Russian propaganda, whether it's directly from the Kremlin or passed on by brain dead Americans as the truth. So I have to ask you, based on what you saw and the people you talked to, and I know you didn't go all over the country extensively and speak to everyone, what is the mood there? Is it true at all that there's this war fatigue, or is it pretty much the way that it's been, which is that they're not giving up and that this is a fight for their existence and they're all in? What's your take on that?
I mean, first of all, let's tackle that phrase war fatigue. War fatigue is something that exists in the West amongst people who are not actually fighting. That is a sense that, oh, is that still going on? I don't want to read about that anymore. This is boring, etc. Ukrainians are exhausted physically and mentally, but they're not fatigued. Fatigue to me suggests some kind of, surrender or giving up. And that is the opposite of what Ukrainians are. They're exhausted and they're traumatized, but they're certainly not giving up because I think all of them, almost without, cut that a little bit, I think all of them, almost without exception, understand that the moment they give up, it's over. It's over for them personally, and it's over for everything that they value. So this isn't, fatigue again is something you might have an option about, might have some control over it. I'm going to go out and go for a jog. Oh no, I'm fatigued. I'm not. I'm going to just flop on the sofa. There's no sense in which Ukrainians have a choice about whether to carry on or not.
That's pretty much what I thought, but I wanted to hear it from you, someone who's just returned from there and spoken with many, many Ukrainians who live this every day. Talking about that, what did you hear from just ordinary Ukrainians, not so much the officials or folks in the military, about what the Trump administration may do? What are their thoughts on this? Are they supporting? Are they Trump supporters? Are they indecisive? Are they scared? What's the thought process right now in Ukraine about the new Trump administration vis-a-vis any peace negotiations with Putin?
I think it's complex. And of course, I spoke to what could be described as ordinary people or those in society. I also spoke to some of Ukraine's, leading journalists and intellectuals. So you'll have a diversity of opinion. Let's start with one of the leading journalists. He said that there is this narrative that's prevalent, and actually I fall into this as well. There's a narrative that's present that Biden did nothing for Ukraine. Biden was slow. Biden sort of had caused Ukraine to bleed out. Therefore, anything is better than that. And I think that is the view of a lot of Ukrainians, which is like Biden by the end, unfortunately, seems to have sort of dragged things out to an extent to cause the attritional war to be worse and cause the attritional loss on the Ukrainian side to be worse than it otherwise could have been. There is some truth in that, I think. But this journalist said, look, basically, maybe. But if Biden hadn't provided any support, there would be no Ukraine now. So I think that's a kind of interesting sort of alternative point of view. And he said the natural view of Ukrainians is actually to be optimists. So of course, they're going to pick out the worst of the thing that's just happened, and they're going to tend to think positively or with an open mind about what's going to come next. So I think that idea was, well, it cannot possibly be worse. Therefore, let's embrace a Trump win. Certainly, you don't get that sense that they are partisan. They're not bringing the whole left-right kind of thing to politics because that's a US domestic framing. They're looking at this from a Ukrainian point of view, thinking, look, Trump is unpredictable. Trump might be better because possibly with his mindset, he understands Putin better, possibly. And he might be able to deal with Putin in a way that Biden couldn't. So there's something to be said for that. And of course, the reality is turning out to be quite complex. No one really knows at this point what is going on and what the proposed peace plan is. No one knows what Trump will do if, as is very likely, Putin turns around and, insults him or humiliates him or refuses, to go along with whatever peace proposals are on the table. So I think the jury is kind of out on that one, not just amongst Ukrainians, but globally. But there is a tendency to think that the Trump could do things for Ukraine which Biden couldn't. That perhaps is sort of, ignoring that the US has its own kind of concerns. And actually, there may be more commonality with Biden and Trump in their lack of understanding about what Russia is and how to deal with Russia. So I think there's that sort of to consider. What they certainly, I think, see is that Western Europe have been, good allies in certain respects, but are not active in building up their own defense, are not as active in supporting Ukraine as perhaps they could be. And I think a lot of Ukrainians fully understand why this happens. but think that it should not. And this is all the loopholes and the gaps that continue to mean that Western goods, consumer goods, dual use goods find their way onto the Russian market through third party subsidiaries. There was even a report this week about how Russia is trying to buy complex machine tools for its military industrial complex via Switzerland. And my fear, of course, is that Europe has just not been serious about closing down these gaps and loopholes, and even now is not getting serious. It could be, that Trump, and again, this is the point of view of Ukrainians, it could be that Trump, if he was minded to, would clamp down on this stuff much more harshly than Biden. Again, maybe there's that potential there. At this point, we don't know what is going to transpire.
How do you gauge the feelings right now of the Ukrainians that you spoke to on their continuing support or lack of support for Zelensky?
Again, this is far more complex than it's made out in the Western media, because whenever you see Zelensky in the Western press, there's this attempt to either take him down or build him up. Either we feel the need to sort of turn someone into a hero and exaggerate their achievements, or we need to tear them down. And I think this is a failing or a weakness in the mechanic of the traditional media. Traditional legacy media needs to create a sensation. It needs to create a story or impose a narrative onto the world to sell copy. You can't just say, here's a nuanced, complex figure, because that's not news. You have to either build them up or tear them down in some way to create the kind of hype you need to frame the article. And we fall into that over and over again. When you talk to Ukrainians, it's far more nuanced. They'll say, look, I didn't vote for the guy. And actually, you know, he's very impressive in certain respects. And actually, maybe he's united the country in a way that nobody else could have at this point, or that he's grown into that role in a way I never would have expected. But they will then privately point to, and I know Ukrainians debate this very, very energetically because they still live in a country with a democratic culture. The law does not allow for an election to take place, and Zelensky's term has expired. And this is an interesting point. I think everybody I spoke to would love to have an election, but understand why it's not possible right now. In fact, most people I spoke to would love the chance even to vote Zelensky out, but except that if that was to happen now, it would open the door to division, chaos, and a massive Russian propaganda and manipulative techniques to try and divide their society. So it's far more complex, right? We didn't vote for the guy. We appreciate some things about him. We don't appreciate others. We can see he's been on a journey of evolution and development. The things he said, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, are very different from what he says now. He understands the threat from Russia much more, and he's the best person for the times. But that doesn't make him a saint, and that doesn't make him perfect. And when you speak to Ukrainians, they'll, you have a beer and they'll dish all the dirt. They'll tell you what they don't like about his government. That's because they're democratic in spirit, He's there as long as he's reflecting the will of the people. The minute he deviates from that and tries to build himself up into some kind of authoritarian figure, he will be gone. There's no question, he'll be gone. And every Ukrainian will show him the door because they do not want an autocrat or a tyrant. And I think that's an important nuance.
Well, Jonathan, I think we're going to have to leave it there for now. We could go on for a very, very long time, but we don't have the time right now. But I know you'll be back. So let's leave it there for today. You and I have a lot to talk about, which I said we may be presenting here in the near future about some plans we have to do something live in support of Ukraine. But we'll leave that for the future. In the meantime, Jonathan Fink, creator and host of the Silicon Curtain on YouTube. Please go there, watch it. You will enjoy it. Thank you again, Jonathan, so much, and you take care.
David, thank you so much. Good luck with everything you do and these big plans, which are so essential for where we are at this point in history.
Thank you. Stay safe and take care.